Are we up? You're up. Why is it technology fails you just when you need it the most? Okay. First off, I'd like to tell you, my name is Bob Willcutt, for those that don't know you. Don't know me. I'm obviously nervous. To be honest with you, I would rather be at the dentist having teeth work done than be speaking publicly. But the Lord has made such wonderful things in my life that I can't help but share them. And so that's why I'm here to share the personal miracle that the Lord has done in my life. And I'm going to give you a little history so that you'll kind of understand what I'm all about. My reasons for my testimony are a couple. One, I want to encourage people to share their faith with others. Two, I want to show you that there's hope for people that struggle with addiction. I was an alcoholic and drug addict for many years, and my life was destroyed until the Lord turned it around. The third thing is, I want to make sure that God gets the glory for this, because it's all about Him and how He cares for us personally, every single one of us, not just as a group, but individually. Even though I was an atheist and didn't believe there was a God, He was always there with me. When I look back on my life, I could see the things that He did to protect me and to encourage me. Even though I was an addict, I wasn't raised that way. My parents didn't drink. They didn't smoke. My dad only had one word of cuss. If he was really frustrated, he might say, damn, but that was it. I got out of the Army in 1967, and that was, for those of you who don't, or too young to remember, that was the era for Vietnam War. It was an ugly situation. A lot of the men that were in the war then came out drug addicts and alcoholics because of the stress they were under. I didn't. I came through that. I didn't drink. I didn't even drink beer when I got out. I was clean. So how did I get to this mess? I had a wife and a child that I wanted to support. And so I was looking for work, and I found a job at CBS Musical Instruments. They make Fender guitars and amplifiers and whatnot. And my job was to build amplifiers. And when I got the job, they explained to me that I had 30 days in which to develop my speed to build enough amplifiers. You had a quota that you had to meet. And if you didn't meet it in 30 days, you lost the job. And it was a good paying job, and I really desperately needed it. So I did my best, and after 3 weeks, I couldn't quite get to my quota. I couldn't quite make it. And I was really frustrated, and I didn't know what to do. And I was talking with my neighbor, Ron. And Ron was a little rough around the edges, but he had a good heart. But he did some drugs and he did some drinking, but he was never really a mess like I got to be. But anyway, I was talking to him and I told him what my problem was, and he says, I got an answer for you, but you're probably not going to like it. He says, I got a pill that you can take, and it speeds up your reflexes. You can work faster. And I said, no, I don't think that's for me. And then later on, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, I've got to do something. And so I told him I would try it. And I figured if it worked, I would just try it long enough that I got used to working fast, and then I would quit. That's what I told myself. So he gave me these pills. They're methadone and benzodrine. They're a little tiny white pill with an X on them, for those that have ever seen them. Don't look like anything. And when I took them, they really worked. They really worked. Immediately, my reflexes were faster, and I was working faster, and I was able to meet the quota and keep the job. And I thought, well, this is really good. But instead of quitting after a while, I realized that the more of these little pills I took, the faster I worked, the more money I made, and it got to be a vicious cycle. Within 6 months, I was the fastest man on the assembly line. I could really fly. Well, during this period, I met some of Ron's friends. One of them was named Jim. And Jim was kind of a hard person to understand. He was very funny. He had a great sense of humor, but he also had kind of a cruel streak, and then it went back and forth. He was heavy into drugs, and I never, ever saw him that he wasn't completely stoned. His eyes were always bloodshot. He was a mess. And it wound up that it got so bad for him that he lost his business. He had a carpet business, and he lost that. He lost his house. His wife walked out, taking the kids, and then Jim just disappeared. And I figured that Jim had probably overdosed, because I had friends that had done that. I figured he was dead. I went for about 1.5 years without ever hearing anything about or from him. And then Ron told me that he had run across Jim and that Jim was doing good. And I said, explain good. What is good? He said, well, he's clean and sober, and his wife came back to him, and he's happy. And I said, what, did he get caught and had to go to rehab or something? And he says, no, he found Jesus. And I said, well, I didn't know he was lost. That was my sarcasm. I mean, I didn't believe there was a God, much less Jesus. And he says, well, you're going to have to talk with him and see him. He's a different man. And I said, nah, it's okay. Another 6 months go by, and finally Jim comes up and starts talking to me. And he's trying to tell me about Jesus. And I said, I don't really want to hear about it. I said, I'm glad that this is working for you, but I don't believe in that stuff, and I don't want to hear about it. And he would come by every couple of weeks and try to talk to me about Jesus. And I got sick of it. I just didn't want to hear another word. And finally I thought, well, if I let him get it out of his system, maybe he'll shut up and leave me alone. So I said, okay, Jim. I said, we're going to sit down. You're going to tell me whatever you have to tell me. And then from then on, I don't want to hear another word. I said, you got 5 minutes. So Jim goes, well, 5 minutes? What am I going to tell you in 5 minutes? He says, first off, he says, God is real. He loves you, and he doesn't want you to hurt. And I went, Jim, shut up, man. I don't want to hear anymore. And I cut him off. I never let him see another word. But yet, that was going to be my turning point in my life, was what he had said then, many years later. For the next 15 years, I kept making bad choices, hanging out with the wrong people, doing the wrong things. I was so bad with my drinking that I would go to sleep with a full bottle of wine, and I'd wake up with an empty one. Didn't even remember drinking it. I mean, I was a basket case for all intensive purposes. And I just continued down that path. In 27th of October 1981, my fourth child was born. His name was Sean. And when he was first born, the doctor comes out and he tells you the things they've found. They do a 10-point test on the child, and he says, your baby's fine, even though he's 2 months premature, he's fine. Now, he was only 2 pounds, 8 ounces. He was tiny. Shortly after that, he told me that they have to put him on a respirator because he can't breathe on his own. He says, but that's not abnormal for a preemie. Okay. So a little bit after that, maybe a day or so after that, they told me he's got some problems with his heart, and we're going to have to do some surgery on him and correct his heart. And I said, well, what exactly is it you've found? And he says, I don't really know any good way of telling you this, but your son's heart is not like any normal human heart. We don't understand how it works, and we're not going to know till we get in there and start looking at it, but we know it's not functioning properly. So they went in and did surgery on his heart. That was Thanksgiving. That's how I spent my Thanksgiving. And he had a 3-chambered heart instead of a 4-chambered heart, and they managed to repair a leak that was in it, and it worked, and he survived the surgery, which they were a little apprehensive about because he was so tiny. But he got through the surgery, and we thought everything was going to be good. Then he started putting out too much insulin from his pancreas. And so Christmas Day, they had to remove half of his pancreas. And they told me that he was still struggling from recovering from the heart surgery, and that I should expect that he probably wouldn't make it through this surgery. But he did. He survived that surgery too. It wasn't long after that, he became hydrocephalic, which means you're holding fluid on top of your brain. Your spinal fluid isn't draining back down, and it puts pressure on your brain. So they had to put a shunt, which is just a tube, in the base of his skull to let the fluid drain back down, and they connect it back to his spine so the fluid to go back down into his spine. And shortly after that, he got an infection from the shunt, and they couldn't stop the infection, and it kept getting worse. And they were showing us I can't think it was a CAT scan or something of his brain, and they could show there's little dark spots. And they said this is part of his brain that's dying. It kept happening, and it kept getting worse, and they couldn't find any antibiotics that would stop it. And finally they told me that he was at a point that if he survived, he would never be anything more than what I was seeing right then. He was basically a vegetable. And we had to make the decision to take him off life support, which was a hard one. But we did, and January 15th of 1982, which is 80 days later, he died. It still hurts to this day. And what hurts the worst is one of the doctors told me that a lot of his problems, like his heart, were caused by the drugs that I was using, that I had created the situation that cost my son his life. A little over a year later, my wife divorced me. I lost my house, my children. All I had left was a little 66 Barracuda car, and it was so bad, had a rod knocking, and you drive down the street, people would turn and hear because they hear this thing banging. It finally wound up dying, and I had a little tiny trailer that my father had given me, and it was so tiny, it didn't have a bathroom or a shower or anything. And I parked it in a boat storage where I was working. I was working at a boat shop, and they allowed me to park there, and I would shower with a hose because that was all I had, cold water. And so life was getting really down for me. I was so depressed. I don't think I had actually ever consciously considered suicide, but I think that was rolling around in the back of my head that there was a way out. And nights were hard for me. I didn't sleep real well. I struggled. The only good thing was I wasn't doing any drugs or alcohol because I didn't have the money to do it. I could barely get enough to eat. So I had no hope. And one night I woke up, it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was just totally depressed. And I remembered what Jim had told me. Jim had told me that God was real and that he loved me and he didn't want me to hurt. I figured there was nobody around to watch me make a fool of myself. So I looked up at the ceiling of my little trailer and I said, God, Jim says you're real. He says you love me and you don't want me to hurt. Show me. I challenged God. I said, show me. Now, I truly expected absolutely nothing to happen. But what happened is still really beyond me completely explaining. But I was surrounded with love. I felt completely enclosed, wrapped in love, if that makes any sense at all. And all my stresses just completely disappeared. I had peace. And I was freaking out. I didn't know what to think. I expected nothing, and here God had answered me very personal. And it was very real. It was just as real as this piece of wood is. It was real. And there was no doubt in my mind. God was real. And I realized then that I needed to do something and find out what this is all about. So I thought, okay, well, what do you do? How do you deal with this? And what do Christians do? They pray. Okay, well, how do you pray? I don't know. I'd never prayed in my life. So I looked back up and I said, Lord, I know you're real. You've showed me. But I don't know anything about you. But I promise, if you help me, I'll find out what you're all about. And I'll make the changes I need to make. The next day, I'm busy working on boats, and my boss comes up to me and he says, you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm all right. I said, am I doing something wrong? And he goes, no. He says, you're just different today. And I said, well, how so? And he goes, I don't know. I just can't put my finger on it, but there's something different. And I wasn't ready to tell him about my experience. So I just kind of shrugged. And a little bit later, he says, I've got a job for you to do. He says, it's going to be a job that's going to take you a while. This lady caught her boat on fire, and it's all burned, and it needs a lot of work. It needs upholstery and wiring and all kinds of stuff. And he says, so she's going to be bringing it in, and you can talk to her and figure out what you need. So this lady turned out to be my wife later, years later. Anyway, she comes in and she's telling me about how her friends had taken this boat out. Her and her girlfriends had taken this boat out and had gone on a lake, and they were having a good time. Well, usually when she went out, her sons went with her, and sometime back, this guy had dumped some turtle wax or something down in her gas tank, and periodically would plug up the carburetor, and her son Michael would clean it out, and they'd be good to go for a while. Well, they're out in the middle of the lake, and the boat stops, and she realizes what it is, and she'd seen Michael do the carburetor several times, so she goes, I can do that. So she tore the carburetor all apart and put it back together, and it ran perfect, except she left the fuel line loose. So the boat burst into flames, and it really got burned bad. And she had 3 other friends with her that 2 of them didn't swim. And so they're climbing out on the bow of the boat because the fire's in the back, and they're terrified because they think they're going to die. Well, God was making provisions for them even then, because not 100 feet away were a bunch of firemen that were on vacation in their boat. And they immediately came over and put the fire out. And so that was all good. They were all saved. And now she needs to get the boat repaired. And she had been dealing with a shop, Harmon Marine, I think was what it was. And she was happy with them. They had already done everything right. And she was going to go there. She hooked the boat up to the truck or to her car, and she started to go out. And she says, "You know, I just don't feel right about this for some reason." She didn't have any peace. She could not do it. So she went back in the house, grabbed the phone book, and just at random picked a boat shop, which is Dana Boats, was where I was working. So God had arranged that too. So she comes in, and her boat was bad, and she wanted it fixed for the next weekend. And it's like, no way, this is going to take weeks. And she's saying, no, it needs to be done this week. I've made plans, it needs to be done this week. And she was talking with the secretary at the time, and the secretary says, "No, it's not going to happen." And she says, "Look, I don't care what it takes. If the boat's not finished, throw the mechanic and his tools in the boat, and he can work on it while we go down the road." And the secretary said, "Oh, he might like that. He's single." So what we wound up doing was tacking old pieces of carpet over her burnt upholstery, and I got the boat running, but that was about all. And she brought it back, and we did some more work. And she asked me if I would like to go with them skiing. And I had had so much turmoil in my life, the last thing I wanted was a woman to complicate issues even more. And I told her, no, I wasn't interested in doing that, but thank you for asking, you know. So I worked on her boat for another week. We got some more of it done. She took it out again, and again she asked me if I would like to go. And I said, no. So over a period of time, she asked me 3 times, and each time I turned her down. And then finally, I had finished all the work. The last time I was going to be in the shop, and she starts to take off with the boat, pulls out in the middle of the street, blocks traffic, backs it all back up into the lot, gets out and walks up to me, and she says, "This is the last time I'm going to ask you." She says, "Would you go on a picnic with me?" Well, I didn't want to, but she was such a nice lady, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings, and I figured, well, picnic can't hurt. So I said, "Okay, I'll go on a picnic with you." And she's, "Okay, fine. Here's my address. Pick me up." She gave me the time. I get to her house, and first thing, I'm in a neighborhood that I don't feel I belong in. It's much too nice, and I'm feeling nervous about that. But I figure I can't leave now. I promised I'd show up, so I did. So I went to her door, and here's her kids lined up. She's got 5 kids, and they're lined up there inspecting me. They're asking me questions, and they want to just what did Mom bring home, you know? And it turned out good. They turned out to be good kids. But anyway, we go on this picnic, and I cannot believe it. Before I realize what I'm doing, I'm telling this lady that I barely know how I had asked God to show me that He loved me, and how He had answered my prayer, and that I needed to find out what He was all about. And as soon as I'm done talking, I realize this lady's probably going to run for her car as quick as she can. I probably have scared her to death. She surprised me, and she just said, "Oh, well, I go to church." She says, "Maybe if you'd like this Sunday, you can go to church with me." So I wound up going to church with her, and a year later, on August 24th of 1985, we married. She was my best friend. She was my lover. She was my teacher. She taught me everything that I needed. All I knew about Jesus when I first asked the Lord to help me was I knew that Jesus was born at Christmas, and I knew that for some reason he had been nailed to a cross, but I knew nothing more than that. And she helped me understand it. She took me to a church that was the right church for me to go to at that time because the people were so loving, and I felt immediately one with them and could relate. A couple of years later, I needed to be fed more, so I went to a church that taught everything out of the Bible, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and I needed that and always have since then. So, God had his hand on all of this, and he made it happen. So since 1985, I have not touched drugs. I have not had a sip of alcohol, and then I have no desire to. I have been fortunate to tell my story in the local jail here, jail ministry, and out at Ironwood Prison, where I did a ministry out there. And it's probably the only time I feel comfortable at all talking in front of people is when I tell them how wonderful the Lord is and how he cares for each of us individually. And he showed me that. Thank you.